No one questioned the births at first. The names were entered into ledgers in different counties, written by different hands on different years, 5 children, 5 plantations, 5 owners, and yet the same woman appeared every time. Her name spelled slightly differently, her age estimated, her origin marked only as previously owned. What no one noticed then, but what the records reveal now, is that these births were not accidents of sale or coincidence of labor. They were part of a quiet system, one that moved a woman not for her strength, not for her skills, but for her womb. Tonight, this is the story of a woman whose body became a traveling inheritance, whose children were scattered across plantations, and whose truth survived only because paper never forgets what people try to erase. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Before we go any further, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the end, because stories like this were never meant to survive, and if they move you, leave a comment telling us how deeply this history affected you, because every response keeps these erased lives from disappearing again. The story begins not with a scream, not with chains, not even with violence, but with ink drying on paper, with a clerk's hand pausing just long enough to decide how to spell a woman's name, because in the world of plantations, spelling was flexible but ownership was not, and in the first surviving ledger dated 1806, along the low, humid stretches of the Cooper River, a young enslaved woman appears under the name Mary, no surname, no lineage, no past worth recording, only an estimated age, 18, and a brief physical description meant to establish value rather than identity, her origin listed vaguely as African uncertain, as if uncertainty itself was sufficient explanation for erasure, and beneath that entry, written with the same casual finality used to note livestock births or harvest yields, is the line that would quietly repeat itself for the next 15 years of her life, delivered of a female child, healthy. There is no space after that line, no margin note, no pause in the ledger's rhythm, because to the system this was not an event but an expectation, a function fulfilled, a return on investment realized, and the page turns immediately to the next account as if nothing significant has occurred. But 4 years later, in a ledger maintained nearly 40 miles away, on a tobacco plantation owned by a different family, another entry appears, dated 1810, this time spelling her name Mary, her age now guessed at 22, described as recently acquired, her physical markers nearly identical, including a small scar on the upper shoulder noted for identification, and again the same phrase appears, almost word for word, as if copied from memory rather than observation, delivered of male issue, sound. And it is here, in this repetition, that the story begins to fracture the illusion of coincidence, because Mary was not simply moved once, or twice, or by chance, but transferred in a pattern that only becomes visible when the records are laid side by side, stripped of their geographic separation, and reunited by the woman they refuse to fully name. Each ledger treats her as new, as if she has no history beyond the moment of purchase, yet the body they describe carries the same measurements, the same notations of temperament, quiet, compliant, obedient, words that signal not character but control. And what becomes unsettling is not just that she gave birth more than once, but that every sale involving her occurred either shortly after a birth or just months before another pregnancy would have become visible, suggesting not ignorance but foresight, not randomness but planning, because in a system obsessed with coincidence is rare and inefficiency is unacceptable. Mary's first child does not follow her to the second plantation, nor does the second accompany her to the third, and the records do not question this separation, because separation was standard practice, justified by language that reduced motherhood to inconvenience and attachment to liability, and yet, what the records reveal unintentionally is a woman whose body was circulating while her children remained fixed, absorbed into the value of land they would never leave, and as each new owner recorded her as recently acquired, the truth of her previous pregnancies was both known and deliberately unspoken, because to acknowledge it explicitly would be to admit that her womb was part of the transaction and transactions function best when their moral dimensions remain unnamed. By the time the third record surfaces in 1813, this time on a cotton plantation newly carved from cleared land, Mary's age is listed as about 26, her name altered again to Maria, and the entry notes her as experienced, a word that appears nowhere else in the ledger, signaling not skill but reliability, and once again the familiar line appears, steady and unembellished, delivered without complication, as if her body's endurance were an expected feature rather than a miracle of survival under relentless strain. No ledger records how she traveled between these places, whether by wagon, boat, or on foot, whether she was restrained or simply resigned, whether she mourned her children in silence or was punished for doing so openly, because the system did not require that information to function, and therefore did not preserve it, but the spacing between entries tells its own story, one of pregnancies timed closely enough to suggest that rest was a luxury she was never afforded, and as these documents accumulate, the language surrounding Mary becomes increasingly clinical, increasingly abstracted, reducing her to a series of outcomes rather than a person enduring them. What is most revealing is what the ledgers do not include: no mention of fathers, no acknowledgement of conception, no hint of circumstance, because to record paternity would invite questions of power, consent, and contradiction that plantation society could not afford to confront. And so the children are listed simply as issue, a term that severs lineage and collapses identity into property, ensuring that Mary's role as mother remains functionally invisible even as her body's productivity is meticulously tracked. By 1817, when the fourth birth is recorded on yet another plantation, this time under the ownership of a widow managing her estate alone, Mary's name is shortened to Ma, her age now listed vaguely as near 30, and for the first time a small annotation appears beside her entry, "Retain until recovery," a phrase that suggests delay, calculation, and the understanding that her value peaked not at the moment of birth but shortly after, when her body had proven itself once again and could be resold at optimal price, and this single note collapses any remaining illusion that her movements were incidental, because it reveals a system that monitored her cycles not out of care but out of commerce. Through these records, Mary becomes less a woman moving through plantations and more a function being transferred between owners, her life segmented into productive intervals, her children distributed like dividends, and yet, despite the system's effort to flatten her existence into numbers and notes, something persists that the ledgers cannot fully suppress, because they must identify her to track her value, and in doing so, they preserve enough detail to allow her story to be reconstructed centuries later. The repetition of her presence across 5 plantations exposes not just her suffering, but the coordination of a system that did not need explicit conspiracy to operate efficiently, because shared values and unspoken rule. Less ensured that everyone understood what a woman like Mary represented, and by the time the 5th ledger appears in 1821, marking yet another birth and yet another sale, the pattern is undeniable, her life reduced to a cycle of arrival, pregnancy, delivery, and departure. And this realization forces us to confront a truth that is often softened in retrospective narratives, that slavery was not merely violent in moments, but methodical over lifetimes, that it relied not only on cruelty, but on routine, and that women like Mary were not just victims of circumstance, but targets of design, selected, circulated, and discarded with bureaucratic precision. This is where the story truly begins, not with her first birth, but with the recognition that her name kept reappearing because it was meant to, because her body had been folded into an economy that thrived on predictability, and as we continue, the records will reveal not only how Mary was used, but how her children were absorbed, how her usefulness was measured, and how her eventual disappearance from the page speaks volumes about what happened to those whose bodies could no longer sustain the system that consumed them. What becomes unmistakably clear as the records continue is that Mary's life was governed not by chance movement or temporary need, but by an unspoken economy that revolved around her body as a renewable resource, because by the early 19th century, especially after the transatlantic trade had slowed and restrictions tightened, the wealth of plantations increasingly depended on the forced reproduction of the enslaved, and women like Mary occupied a grim position at the center of that strategy, valued less for who they were than for what they could produce repeatedly and predictably. In plantation accounting books, there is a noticeable shift in language when describing men versus women of childbearing age, because where men are assessed primarily by strength, endurance, and labor output, women are measured by health, recovery time, and fertility, and Mary's entries reflect this distinction with chilling clarity, noting her ability to resume duties swiftly, her sound constitution, and her lack of complications, phrases that read like clinical assessments rather than observations of a human life, and these descriptors travel with her from ledger to ledger, acting as endorsements that increased her desirability in the marketplace. Each sale involving Mary follows a similar pattern. She is purchased at a higher valuation shortly before pregnancy would become apparent, retained through childbirth and initial recovery, and then sold again at a price reflecting proven fertility. And this rhythm reveals a system that understood the female body not as a living being, but as a timed investment, one whose returns could be calculated with unsettling accuracy. The absence of any recorded skill beside Mary's name becomes increasingly telling, because it suggests that her primary function had been clearly established early on, and once established, it defined the course of her life more rigidly than chains ever could, determining where she would go, how long she would stay, and when she would be moved again. Plantation owners did not need to discuss her purpose explicitly because the market itself communicated it, circulating reputations quietly through sales, auctions, and private agreements. And a woman who had delivered healthy children multiple times would have been recognized immediately, her value understood without explanation. This is why Mary's name appears in transactions that otherwise show little overlap, connecting estates that did not share laborers or resources, but shared an understanding of profit, and through this network, her womb became portable capital, transferable without concern for continuity of family or emotional consequence. The ledgers show that each time Mary was sold, her child remained behind, absorbed seamlessly into the property of the plantation where it was born, because under the law, the status of the child followed the mother, but ownership followed the owner at the moment of birth, and this legal structure incentivized separation, ensuring that women could be moved freely while their children increased the wealth of those who kept them. There is no record of negotiation over her children, no indication that their presence was ever considered part of her personhood, because the system did not recognize maternal bonds as legitimate claims, and to acknowledge them would have disrupted the clean efficiency of transactions designed to maximize output. What is especially disturbing is how quickly this process normalized itself, because by Mary's third recorded pregnancy, the ledgers no longer bothered to specify first issue or second issue, but simply list delivered, as if repetition itself had erased the need for detail, reducing her experiences to a recurring function that no longer required justification. The business of the womb operated quietly, without spectacle, because it did not rely on visible brutality to be effective. Instead, it relied on routine, paperwork, and the collective agreement that certain bodies existed primarily to sustain an economic order. Mary's movements between plantations mirrored trade routes rather than journeys, following paths dictated by demand rather than need, and each relocation placed her in a new environment where her past was deliberately ignored, allowing owners to treat her as both experienced and new, valuable yet replaceable, a contradiction that only made sense within a system that commodified human life. The records also suggest that Mary's pregnancies were not treated as disruptions to labor, but as parallel processes, because notes indicate she continued working well into term and was returned to lighter duties only briefly, reinforcing the idea that her body was expected to function continuously, producing labor and life simultaneously. There is no indication of rest beyond what was necessary to protect the investment, no recognition of pain beyond its potential to reduce value, and no concern for long-term health once her fertility had been demonstrated sufficiently. As Mary's reputation grew, so did the efficiency with which she was circulated, because by the time of her fourth pregnancy, the timing of her sale suggests that prospective buyers anticipated her delivery, positioning themselves to acquire her at the most advantageous moment, a practice that underscores how deeply reproduction had been integrated into the economics of slavery. This was not an aberration but a refinement, a response to market pressures that encouraged owners to view women's bodies as sites of production that could be optimized through movement and management, and Mary's life became a case study in that optimization, her existence reduced to a series of productive intervals that could be bought, sold, and transferred with minimal friction. The silence surrounding her consent, her resistance, or her suffering is not accidental, because the system functioned best when such questions were never asked, and the ledgers reflect that priority by recording only what mattered to profit, leaving everything else unspoken. Yet, in that silence, a different kind of truth emerges, one that speaks through repetition rather than testimony, revealing how Mary's body was trapped in a cycle that had no natural endpoint, because as long as she could conceive, she could be used, and as long as she could be used, she would be moved. This realization forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that Mary's story is not exceptional because of its cruelty, but because the records survive to expose it, and as we continue, the focus shifts from the system that exploited her womb to the children produced by it, scattered across plantations, growing up without knowledge of one another, or of the woman whose body made their lives possible, and through discretion, the long shadow of this business becomes even clearer, revealing how the exploitation of one woman reverberated across generations, shaping lives that were never allowed to know their origin. As Mary's recorded life extends across ledgers and years, what emerges is not merely a trail of transactions, but a map of deliberate silence, because each plantation that acquired her inherited not only her body, but the understanding that her past was both valuable and unspeakable, and this unspoken agreement allowed 5 different owners, operating independently, to participate in the same exploitation without ever needing to coordinate explicitly, creating a continuity of abuse that feels almost seamless when viewed through the records. The third plantation to which Mary was transferred lay on newly cleared cotton land, a place where the soil was raw and the labor relentless. And here the ledger introduces her with a brief phrase that appears nowhere else. Previously accustomed, a term that acknowledges experience while refusing context, signaling that she arrived already shaped by prior use, already conditioned to endure what would be demanded of her. There is no note about adjustment, no comment on acclamation, because Mary was not expected to struggle. She was expected to perform, and the records show that she did, delivering another child within a predictable span, her body once again fulfilling its assigned role. What is striking is how each owner records her as if she has no emotional residue, no attachments, no history beyond the marks on her body that serve identification purposes, because acknowledging memory or grief would complicate ownership, and so the silence surrounding her inner life becomes as consistent as the pattern of her exploitation. Across 5 plantations, Mary is never described as distressed, resistant, or grieving, not because she was unaffected, but because the system lacked language for enslaved suffering unless it threatened productivity, and grief, when it did not disrupt labor, was rendered invisible. The 4th plantation, owned by a widow managing her late husband's estate, provides perhaps the most revealing documentation, because the widow's meticulous records include marginal notes about timing, spacing, and recovery that suggest a careful observation of Mary's reproductive cycles. And yet even here, where attention is closest, the language remains detached, referring to Mary's body as if it were a machine whose output could be regulated through movement and oversight. The widow's ledger notes Mary's transfer only weeks after childbirth, a decision framed as necessity rather than choice, justified by debts and obligations that reduced Mary's humanity to collateral, and this justification appears again and again in plantation records, where financial pressure becomes a moral shield, allowing owners to claim inevitability where there was, in fact, agency. As Mary moves from one estate to another, the records grow increasingly sparse, as if repetition itself dulls the need for description, and by the time she reaches the fifth plantation, her presence is almost formulaic, introduced with minimal detail, her pregnancy anticipated rather than observed, her delivery recorded without remark, because she has become predictable, and predictability, in a system built on control, is the highest form of compliance. The absence of fathers in these records becomes even more conspicuous as the pattern continues, because 5 births across 5 plantations necessarily imply multiple men, multiple acts of coercion or exploitation, and yet not a single ledger acknowledges this reality, choosing instead to isolate the outcome from its cause, a practice that protects the social order by obscuring the mechanisms through which it reproduces itself. By erasing paternity, the records erase accountability, ensuring that no white man's name is ever linked to the creation of enslaved children, while Mary's body bears the full weight of reproduction, her womb absorbing both the physical burden and the moral deflection that allows the system to persist unchallenged. Each plantation treats her children as new assets, integrated immediately into labor hierarchies that will shape their lives from infancy, and yet the records do not note Mary's proximity to them, because proximity is irrelevant once ownership is established, and attachment is treated as a weakness that must be discouraged rather than a bond to be preserved. The children's names, when they appear, differ from plantation to plantation, reflecting the preferences of owners rather than any continuity of maternal identity, and this naming practice further fragments Mary's lineage, ensuring that her children will grow up without a shared sense of origin, each believing themselves singular rather than part of a larger pattern. What binds these plantations together is not geography or kinship, but a shared understanding of value, an understanding that allows Mary to be passed along like a trusted instrument, her reputation preceding her even as her personhood is denied, and this understanding is reinforced through auctions, private sales, and wordless recognition among owners who know how to read the signs of profitability in a woman's record. The silence that envelops Mary's life is therefore not an absence of information, but a presence of intention, because what is omitted consistently, strategically, and across multiple contexts, revealing a system that knows exactly what it is doing and chooses not to speak of it. As Mary's age advances in the ledgers, marked imprecisely as near 30 or past prime, the language surrounding her begins to shift subtly, introducing qualifiers that hint at diminishing value, and this shift marks the beginning of her decline within the system, not because she has failed, but because the system's appetite is relentless and unforgiving, discarding even those who have served it faithfully once their usefulness wanes. Yet even as her value decreases, the silence remains intact, because acknowledging the cost of her exploitation would require confronting the humanity that has been systematically denied, and so the records continue to speak only of outcomes, leaving the reader to reconstruct the reality from fragments and patterns rather than testimony. This reconstruction reveals that Mary's life was not defined by a single act of cruelty, but by a sustained process of reduction, one that stripped her of continuity, family, and recognition, replacing them with a cycle of use that spanned years and locations, and as we move forward, the focus will shift from the plantations that consumed her labor to the children left behind in her wake, whose lives unfold within the same system that produced them, carrying forward the consequences of a silence that began long before they were born and would continue long after Mary herself disappeared from the page. As the ledgers continue to unfold beyond Mary herself, the story widens not through her voice, but through the scattered lives that emerged from her body and were immediately absorbed into different worlds, because the system that circulated her womb also ensured that the children born from it would never form a recognizable family, never occupy the same space, never share a memory that could challenge the fiction of separation that made their exploitation efficient. Each child enters the records independently, listed not as belonging to a mother but as an addition to inventory, their identities shaped from the moment of birth by the plantation that claimed them, and this dispersal is so complete that no document ever places two of Mary's children on the same page, let alone the same property, a fragmentation that feels intentional when viewed alongside the timing of Mary's sales. The first child, born on the rice plantation along the Cooper River, appears years later in a separate ledger as a young Fay, male, suitable for domestic training, her age aligning with the earlier birth record, but her name entirely different, severing any visible link to Mary except through careful cross-referencing that no contemporary reader would have attempted. She is trained for housework, valued for obedience rather than strength, and her proximity to the main house suggests a life shaped by proximity to power without protection from it, because domestic placement often meant exposure rather than safety. The second child, born on the tobacco plantation, surfaces briefly in a labor role as a boy, assigned to light field duty, his presence noted only insofar as it contributes to output, and later disappears from the records altogether after a year marked by illness that swept through the region, leaving no death entry, no burial notation, only absence, which in plantation documentation often meant loss without accounting. The third child, born on the cotton land, is recorded as surviving into adolescence, eventually sold west as part of a larger transaction that redistributed labor to expanding territories, and this movement ensures that whatever faint possibility of reunion might have existed is extinguished by distance, because westward sales were often final, removing individuals from any network that might remember their origins. The fourth child, born under the widow's ownership, remains on the estate longer, appearing intermittently in household accounts as an expense and later as a contributor, and though this proximity might suggest continuity, the records never connect this child back to Mary once she is sold again, as if the system itself insists on amnesia, erasing maternal presence, to reinforce the idea that children belong exclusively to property rather than people. The fifth child, the last recorded birth, is the most elusive, appearing only once as infant with no subsequent entries to trace a life beyond infancy, and this absence could signify death, sale, or neglect, but the records do not care which, because the outcome does not alter the balance sheets that govern documentation. What binds these children together is not shared experience, but shared erasure, because each one is raised within a plantation narrative that treats them as isolated units, detached from lineage, their identities shaped by the needs and myths of the estates that claim them. Naming practices reinforce this separation, because each owner selects names that align with their own conventions, often biblical or classical, ensuring that even if the children were ever to hear of one another, recognition would be unlikely, their shared blood obscured by linguistic difference. The law supports this fragmentation by defining enslaved children as inheriting status from the mother while inheriting ownership from the moment of birth, a distinction that allows owners to exploit reproduction without acknowledging relationship, turning motherhood into a mechanism that produces property rather than family. For Mary, this meant that each birth initiated not a bond but a rupture, because the child's legal and economic identity diverged from hers immediately, anchoring them to a place she would soon be forced to leave, and the repetition of this process compounds the loss in ways that are difficult to articulate, because it denies not only reunion but recognition, leaving no sanctioned space for grief to be acknowledged. The records never note Mary's proximity to her children beyond the moment of delivery, never mention nursing arrangements, never describe interaction, because these details are irrelevant to valuation, and yet their omission is itself revealing, because it suggests a deliberate narrowing of focus designed to strip reproduction of its human context. The children grow up within the same system that produced them, trained to accept separation as normal because it is all they have ever known, and any questions about origin are discouraged by silence or punished as insubordination, reinforcing the idea that the past is not something to be explored, but something to be endured. As years pass, the children's lives intersect indirectly through the system's rhythms, harvests, sales, relocations, but never through kinship, and this absence of connection serves the interests of owners by preventing the formation of networks that might resist control, because family bonds can foster solidarity, memory, and claims that challenge property relations. The psychological impact of this fragmentation is not recorded, but its effects can be inferred from patterns of behavior noted elsewhere in plantation records, where individuals without recognized kinship ties are described as detached or self-contained, terms that hint at adaptive strategies developed in response to relentless separation. For Mary's children, growing up without knowledge of one another or of the woman who bore them means inheriting a sense of dislocation that becomes normalized, passed down as part of the lived experience of enslavement, and this normalization is one of the system's most effective tools because it transforms extraordinary loss into ordinary life. The absence of reunion is not merely a tragic outcome but a functional requirement, because reunions would expose patterns, and patterns invite scrutiny, and scrutiny threatens the moral insulation that allows exploitation to continue unchallenged. By ensuring that Mary's children are dispersed, the system preserves its own invisibility, preventing any single plantation from having to confront the cumulative consequences of its practices, and this dispersal is mirrored in the way records are kept, scattered across counties and decades, requiring deliberate effort to assemble into a coherent narrative. When viewed together, these records reveal a family that existed only in potential, never allowed to materialize, because the system recognized that the formation of family could undermine the logic of ownership, and so it intervened preemptively, structuring separation into the very process of reproduction. As Mary's children grow into roles defined by their respective plantations, their lives diverge so completely that they might as well belong to different worlds, and yet they carry within them a shared origin that remains unacknowledged, a silent inheritance that shapes their existence without ever being named. This is the quiet violence of fragmentation, one that leaves no single wound to point to, no moment of rupture that can be isolated, because it unfolds over time through routine decisions that collectively dismantle the possibility of continuity. And as we move forward in the story, the focus shifts again, away from the children whose lives were scattered and toward the mechanisms that allowed this scattering to occur without resistance, examining how records, law, and custom worked together to sustain a system that depended not only on exploitation, but on the systematic prevention of connection, ensuring that Mary's legacy would be measured in output rather than relationship, and that the children she bore would grow up never knowing that they were part of a larger story deliberately kept out of reach. By the time Mary's children were fully absorbed into separate plantations, the machinery that enabled her exploitation had become so normalized that it no longer required concealment, only routine, and it is here that the records themselves begin to speak more loudly than any testimony ever could, because while people forgot, denied, or justified what they were doing, paper continued to accumulate evidence with an indifference that now exposes the truth they never intended to preserve. Plantation ledgers were not written to tell stories, they were written to balance accounts, to ensure continuity of profit, to track assets over time, and precisely because of that purpose, they reveal patterns that no individual record acknowledges, patterns that only become visible when documents are read together across years and ownerships, collapsing distance and exposing design. In Mary's case, these records show not only her repeated movement, but the consistency with which her reproductive history is treated as both essential and unspeakable, a contradiction that lies at the heart of the system, because her fertility is the reason she is circulated, yet it is never discussed openly, never contextualized, never connected to her humanity. The language used to describe her remains remarkably stable even as ownership changes, suggesting that there existed a shared vocabulary for women like Mary, a shorthand understood across plantations, in which words like sound, experienced, and accustomed carried specific meanings that signaled reproductive reliability without ever naming it directly. These words functioned as codes, allowing owners to communicate value while maintaining plausible deniability, because to name exploitation explicitly would have required moral reckoning, and the system was designed to avoid such reckoning at all costs. What the records reveal, therefore, is not ignorance but deliberate abstraction, a process by which human experiences are stripped of context until they can be managed without discomfort, and Mary's life becomes a sequence of outcomes rather than a narrative of endurance. When examined closely, the spacing between entries reveals another layer of intent, because her sales are not merely clustered around births, but aligned with seasonal cycles of demand, suggesting that buyers anticipated both her deliveries and the market's needs, timing transactions to maximize return while minimizing downtime. This coordination did not require explicit communication between owners because it was embedded in shared practices, reinforced by law, custom, and economic incentive, creating a system that could operate efficiently even when individuals acted independently. The records also show how easily Mary's suffering was converted into justification, because each sale is framed as necessity: debts to settle, land to maintain, estates to balance, language that transforms choice into obligation, allowing owners to portray themselves as constrained rather than complicit, even as they benefited directly from the exploitation they claim to endure. This framing appears repeatedly in plantation correspondence, where financial pressure becomes a moral shield, deflecting responsibility onto circumstance and obscuring the fact that these circumstances were created and sustained by the very system being defended. The absence of Mary's voice in these records is not a flaw but a feature, because plantation documentation was never intended to capture the perspectives of the enslaved, only to manage them, and yet, through repetition and consistency, Mary's presence asserts itself despite this exclusion, emerging as a figure whose life can be reconstructed precisely because it was so thoroughly controlled. Each time her name appears, slightly altered but unmistakable, it reinforces the reality that she was known, recognized, and valued for a specific purpose, and that this recognition traveled with her even as her personal history was erased. The records also expose how children born to enslaved women were treated not as dependents, but as increments of value, their existence folded seamlessly into balance sheets, and this treatment extends beyond Mary's case, revealing a broader logic in which reproduction functions as a form of capital generation, one that could be optimized through management and movement. In this context, Mary's repeated pregnancies are not aberrations but indicators of success, evidence that the system is working as intended, and the records celebrate this success indirectly by noting increased valuations, stable output, and smooth transfers. What they do not record is the cost of this success, because cost, when borne by the enslaved, does not register as lost WI. Thin the system's accounting framework. Yet, it is precisely this omission that allows the records to indict themselves, because the absence of concern becomes a form of evidence, revealing a moral economy in which human suffering is invisible unless it disrupts profit. As Mary ages, the language surrounding her begins to change subtly, introducing qualifiers that hint at decline, and this shift marks a critical transition because it reveals how quickly value can evaporate once usefulness wanes, and how little loyalty or recognition accrues even to those who have served the system repeatedly. The records note her as aging, less robust, no longer suited for heavy expectation, phrases that signal an impending reassessment of her worth, and this reassessment unfolds without sentiment, because sentiment has no place in a ledger designed to optimize returns. The very efficiency with which Mary is reduced to a diminishing asset underscores the brutality of a system that consumes lives and discards them without acknowledgement, and yet, because this process is documented, it leaves behind a trail that can be followed, allowing later readers to see what contemporaries chose not to see. When historians piece together these fragments, aligning dates, names, and movements, a story emerges that challenges the sanitized narratives often presented about plantation life. revealing a reality defined not by isolated acts of cruelty, but by sustained methodical exploitation woven into everyday practice. Mary's story becomes a lens through which the broader system can be understood, because it illustrates how exploitation was not only normalized, but institutionalized, supported by laws that defined enslaved people as property, by customs that discouraged acknowledgement of family bonds, and by economic structures that rewarded those who could extract the most value from human bodies. The records also reveal how this system protected itself by dispersing responsibility, ensuring that no single owner could be held accountable for the full scope of harm, because each participated only in a segment of Mary's exploitation, allowing them to claim ignorance of the whole. This fragmentation of responsibility mirrors the fragmentation of Mary's family, reinforcing a logic that prevents both moral reckoning and collective resistance, and it is only through retrospective assembly that the full picture becomes visible. In this way, the records function as both instruments of oppression and inadvertent witnesses, preserving traces of lives they sought to manage rather than honor, and it is through these traces that Mary's endurance becomes legible, not as a heroic narrative imposed from outside, but as a fact embedded in the very documents that reduced her to property. As we move forward, the focus shifts again, from the records that reveal Mary's exploitation to the moment when those records fall silent, examining what happens when a body that has been so thoroughly documented suddenly disappears from the page, and what that disappearance tells us about the final stage of a system that measures human worth solely by utility, leaving behind only questions when that utility is exhausted. When Mary's usefulness began to wane, the change did not arrive as a single event, but as a gradual thinning of attention, a quiet recalibration of value that unfolded in the margins of the same records that had once tracked her movements with such care, because in a system built on extraction, decline is not announced, it is inferred, managed, and finally ignored. The language surrounding her shifts almost imperceptibly at first, from confidence to caution, from assurance to qualification, as if the clerks themselves sensed that her body no longer promised the same returns, and in one of the final entries where she appears by name, she is described not by what she can produce, but by what she can no longer be expected to endure. Her age now listed vaguely as past prime, H.E.R. health marked as uneven, terms that signal a reassessment taking place behind the scenes. There is no record of illness severe enough to explain this change, no accident, no dramatic failure, only the accumulated toll of years spent bearing children without recovery, laboring without reprieve, and being moved repeatedly without stability, and it is precisely this absence of singular cause that reveals how the system operates. Because it does not wait for collapse to withdraw investment, it anticipates decline and adjusts accordingly. Mary's final sale is recorded with noticeably less detail than previous transactions, her valuation reduced, her description abbreviated, as if she has become less worthy of notation, and this reduction mirrors the way aging enslaved women were often treated once their reproductive potential diminished, reassigned to harder labor, sold at lower prices, or simply retained without further expectation until their bodies gave out. The records do not specify where Mary goes next, only that she is removed as part of a broader adjustment to the estate, a word that obscures as much as it reveals, because removal could mean sale, transfer, or relocation to less visible labor, and the ambiguity itself is telling, because once Mary's primary function had been fulfilled, the system no longer required precision in documenting her fate. This is where the paper trail thins, not because Mary's life suddenly became less eventful, but because it became less profitable, and in plantation accounting, profit determined visibility. The disappearance of her name from subsequent ledgers is not evidence of peace or freedom, but of erasure, the final stage in a process that had already stripped her of family, continuity, and recognition, leaving behind a body that could no longer justify the attention it once commanded. In many plantation records, this kind of disappearance signals death, but death itself is often unrecorded for enslaved people, especially those whose passing does not materially affect the estate, and so Mary's end is left undefined, her life dissolving into the silence that follows utility. This silence is not neutral. It is an outcome engineered by a system that documents what it values and ignores what it discards, and Mary's absence from the page becomes a stark reminder of how thoroughly human existence could be reduced to function. What remains, however, are the traces she left behind in the lives of her children, traces that continue to ripple through the records long after her name disappears, because while Mary herself could be erased once she ceased to produce, the children born from her body remained assets, their lives extending the system's reach into the future. These children, now adolescents or young adults, appear sporadically in labor rolls, sale notices, and estate inventories, their existence a quiet testament to Mary's endurance, even as her own story is allowed to fade. The system that discarded her does not discard them, because they represent renewed value, fresh bodies to labor, new lives to exploit, and in this way, Mary's exploitation continues beyond her own lifespan, embedded in the generational logic of slavery. The absence of any recorded acknowledgement of Mary's death or final condition underscores a fundamental truth about the system, that it did not consider enslaved lives worthy of closure, only of consumption, and once consumed, they were simply replaced. This lack of closure is itself a form of violence, because it denies not only dignity in life but recognition in death, leaving no sanctioned space for mourning or remembrance. For historians and readers piecing together Mary's story centuries later, this silence poses a challenge, because it forces interpretation in the absence of definitive endpoints, requiring us to read disappearance as evidence rather than absence, and to understand that in plantation records, what is not written often speaks as loudly as WH is. Mary's disappearance from the page aligns with broader patterns observed across enslaved populations, where women who had borne multiple children often vanished from documentation once their reproductive years ended, suggesting that their bodies were expended and their lives concluded without ceremony, their contributions absorbed into the wealth of others without acknowledgement. This pattern exposes the ruthless efficiency of a system that extracted value from every stage of life and discarded individuals once extraction was no longer possible, and it challenges narratives that portray slavery as a static institution, revealing instead a dynamic economy that adapted, optimized, and consumed with relentless focus. Mary's story, reconstructed from fragments, becomes emblematic of this process, illustrating how a woman could be central to an economic strategy for years and then vanish without trace once her usefulness declined, leaving behind only the consequences of her exploitation. The emotional weight of this realization lies not in imagining a singular moment of suffering, but in recognizing the cumulative erosion of self that such a life entailed, because Mary's endurance did not lead to reprieve or recognition, only to exhaustion and erasure. Yet even in this erasure, her story persists, because the records that sought to manage her life inadvertently preserved enough detail to allow her existence to be rediscovered, challenging the system's attempt to render her invisible. As we continue, the focus shifts from Mary's disappearance to the broader implications of her story, examining how the system that exploited and discarded her relied on the deliberate forgetting of individuals to sustain itself, and how remembering her now forces us to confront the full scope of a history that was designed to leave no witnesses, only outcomes. What becomes unavoidable, once Mary's name fades from the ledgers and her children continue on without her, is the realization that the system depended not only on exploitation but on a carefully maintained blindness, a collective decision about what was worth seeing and what was safer, left unacknowledged, because history, as it was recorded at the time, did not simply omit Mary's suffering by accident. It excluded it by design. Plantation society trained itself to look at human lives through the narrow lens of utility, and anything that did not directly affect output, valuation, or control was rendered peripheral, unworthy of ink, and this selective vision shaped not only what was written down, but what was remembered, taught, and passed forward as acceptable truth. In this framework, Mary's repeated pregnancies were visible only as results, never as experiences, and her disappearance was acceptable because it did not disrupt the continuation of profit. illustrating how easily a life could be erased once it no longer served an economic function. The law reinforced this blindness by codifying people as property, reducing relationships to transactions, and redefining violence as management, and within such a structure, to see Mary fully, to see her as a mother, a woman, a person, would have been to recognize a contradiction that threatened the legitimacy of the entire system. As a result, plantation records, legal documents, and social customs worked together to create a version of reality in which Mary existed only intermittently, appearing when she produced something of value and disappearing when she did not. And this intermittent visibility allowed owners and overseers to maintain a sense of order and morality without confronting the cumulative harm they inflicted. Over time, this selective vision hardened into tradition, shaping how subsequent generations understood the past, because children raised in plantation households learned early which questions were not to be asked, which absences were not to be noted, and which silences were to be respected. The erasure of Mary's story was therefore not an isolated failure of documentation, but part of a broader cultural practice that treated enslaved lives as background, as context rather than content, ensuring that even when suffering was widespread, it remained individualized and therefore easier to ignore. This practice extended beyond Mary to countless others whose lives were similarly fragmented and undocumented, creating a historical landscape marked by gaps that are often mistaken for neutrality or inevitability, rather than recognized as the outcome of deliberate choices about what mattered. When later historians encountered these records, many accepted their limitations at face value, focusing on what could be quantified: numbers of enslaved people, acres cultivated, profits generated, while leaving unexamined the human stories that fell outside those metrics, and in doing so, they perpetuated the same blindness that the system had relied upon. It is only through sustained effort, through the patient cross-referencing of ledgers, bills of sale, birth records, and estate inventories, that Mary's pattern becomes visible, and even then, it emerges not as a complete narrative, but as a constellation of hints that require interpretation, reminding us that history is not merely discovered but reconstructed, shaped by the questions we are willing to ask. The fact that Mary's story can be reconstructed at all is a testament to the unintended honesty of bureaucracy, because while individual record keepers may have intended to obscure or minimize, the accumulation of their work over time creates a transparency they could not anticipate, allowing later readers to see what contemporaries normalized. This transparency reveals that the exploitation of enslaved women's reproductive labor was not a marginal practice but a central strategy, one that underpinned the sustainability of slavery in regions where importation declined and internal reproduction became essential, and yet this strategy remains underrepresented in popular narratives, which often focus on male labor in fields while relegating women's experiences to the background. Mary's life challenges that imbalance by demonstrating how deeply women's bodies were integrated into the economic logic of slavery, and how their exploitation extended beyond labor into the most intimate aspects of existence, shaping not only their own lives, but the lives of generations to come. The choice not to see this aspect of history was not accidental. It was reinforced by discomfort, by the desire to maintain heroic or sanitized narratives, and by the lingering influence of the very power structures that benefited from such omissions. To acknowledge Mary fully would require acknowledging that wealth, lineage, and stability were built not only on visible labor, but on invisible suffering, on pregnancies planned and managed without consent, on children separated at birth and raised as property, and on women discarded once their bodies could no longer produce. This acknowledgement threatens comforting myths about progress and benevolence, and so it has often been avoided, replaced with abstractions that soften the edges of reality. The records resist this softening, because when read closely, they reveal a system that was brutally logical, one that aligned law, economy, and custom to extract maximum value from human bodies while minimizing moral friction. And Mary's story sits squarely within that logic, neither anomalous nor accidental. The fact that her children's lives continue in the records, while hers ends abruptly, underscores how history privileges continuity of property over continuity of personhood, preserving what can be owned and discarding what cannot. And this privileging shapes not only what is remembered, but how memory itself is structured. As we confront this, we are forced to reconsider the meaning of absence in historical narratives, recognizing that silence often signals not a lack of information, but a boundary drawn to protect certain interests, and that crossing that boundary requires deliberate effort and willingness to dwell in discomfort. Mary's life, reconstructed from fragments, becomes a challenge to the way history has been told, urging us to look beyond what is immediately visible and to question why certain stories remain incomplete, why certain lives are reduced to footnotes or vanish altogether. In doing so, her story also illuminates the broader mechanisms of erasure that have shaped our understanding of the past, reminding us that history is not just a record of what happened, but a record of what was deemed worth recording, and that to recover lives like Mary's is to confront the values that once governed that judgment. As we move toward the final part of this story, the focus turns to what it means to remember Mary now, not as a symbol or abstraction, but as a person whose life reveals the costs of a system that sought to render her invisible, and to consider how the act of remembrance itself becomes a form of resistance against the historical blindness that allowed her suffering to be normalized and forgotten. By the time we reach the end of Mary's documented trail, what remains is not a neat conclusion, but a reckoning with how truth survives despite every effort to suppress it. Because the same paper that reduced her to entries and valuations ultimately preserved the evidence of her existence in ways that the people who wrote those records never anticipated. And it is in this unintended preservation that Mary's story finally reclaims its weight. The ledgers did not set out to remember her, they set out to control her, to track value and manage outcomes, and yet, when read against one another, they reveal a life shaped by intention rather than accident, exposing a system that treated reproduction as infrastructure and women as conduits through which wealth could be sustained. Mary's disappearance from the records might suggest erasure, but erasure is never complete when traces remain, and those traces, once assembled, speak with a clarity that no single document could provide, telling us that her life mattered not because the system acknowledged it, but because it depended on it. The truth that paper could not bury is not simply that Mary existed or that she suffered, but that her suffering was structured, anticipated, and normalized, woven into everyday practices that allowed exploitation to persist without spectacle or outrage. This truth challenges us to reconsider how we understand evidence, because it demonstrates that absence itself can be a form of documentation, that gaps and silences are not empty but charged with meaning, signaling where the system chose not to look and inviting us to look there now. Mary's story also reframes the idea of legacy, because while she left no recognized lineage, no recorded descendants who could claim her name, her impact endures through the very wealth and continuity that her body helped produce, a legacy that history has often celebrated without acknowledging its source. To confront this is to confront the uncomfortable reality that prosperity and stability were frequently built on lives rendered invisible, and that the erasure of those lives was not incidental but necessary to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. In remembering Mary, we are not merely adding a name to the past, we are exposing the mechanics of forgetting that allowed her exploitation to be absorbed into normalcy, revealing how systems protect themselves by distributing harm across time and space so that no single moment demands accountability. Her story invites us to see slavery not as a series of isolated cruelties, but as a coordinated process sustained by law, economy, and culture, a process that relied on the exploitation of women's bodies in ways that remain under-acknowledged even today. The children Mary bore, scattered across plantations, represent the continuation of that process, living evidence of how one woman's life could be consumed to sustain a system that would then erase her, and their trajectories remind us that the consequences of such exploitation do not end with the individual, but ripple outward, shaping generations who inherit conditions they did not choose. Mary's endurance, reconstructed from records that sought to manage rather than honor her, becomes a form of testimony precisely because it resists closure, refusing to be contained within a single narrative arc or moral lesson, and instead demanding sustained attention to the structures that produced her experience. In this sense, remembering Mary is not about finding redemption in the past, but about sharpening our understanding of how power operates, how value is assigned, and how humanity can be systematically stripped away without overt brutality, replaced instead by routine and paperwork. The truth that paper could not bury is that systems leave signatures, and those signatures can be read if we are willing to look beyond what is explicitly stated, to interrogate patterns, to question silences, and to resist the temptation to accept official records as neutral reflections of reality. Mary's life, pieced together from fragments, stands as a counter-narrative to histories that prioritize triumph and progress while marginalizing suffering, reminding us that what is celebrated often rests on what has been concealed. As we sit with this story, we are asked not only to acknowledge what happened, but to consider how similar mechanisms of erasure operate in other contexts, how lives continue to be valued selectively, and how remembrance itself can function as an act of resistance against systems that benefit from forgetting. Mary did not leave behind letters or testimonies, but she left behind a pattern that speaks with its own authority, one that challenges us to expand our understanding of evidence and to honor lives that were never meant to be remembered. If this story has stayed with you, if it has unsettled or reshaped how you think about history, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the truths that were hidden in plain sight. And now leave a comment telling us how powerful and important this story felt to you. Because every act of remembrance pushes back against the silence that once tried to swallow lives like Mary's. Ensuring that the truth paper could not bury continues to be seen, heard, and carried forward